everyone. Thank you, David, for the fantastic introduction. Couldn't ask for better. I'm Hong-Anh Nguyen. I am the Information Service Manager at the King's Fund. David's claimed me as one of his own. It's great to be here. I wasn't here yesterday, and I was following it on Twitter, and it was really great to see that equality and diversity and inclusion were kind of golden threads that was running through a lot of the presentation. And it made me reflect. I feel like that diversity and inclusion is having a real moment in our profession. This is a real kind of point in which we're increasingly talking about it and paying attention to it. And I think this is the second time that I'm presenting on diversity and inclusion at a library conference in as many weeks. And I think that's testament to our growing attention to this vital area. Libraries don't exist in a bubble. We're a microcosm of society. We exist within a society, and that we're having these discussions reflect the fact that wider society is having those discussions too. So I get asked a lot when I talk about equality and diversity, what can services and organisations and systems do? What should they be doing? Before we get into that, I want to get everyone involved. I'd like to see a show of hands if you think your organisation or institution is racist. Okay, thank you. What about your library? Do you think your library is racist? Fantastic, thank you. Do you think your organisation is sexist? Someone with two hands up, I love it. What about your library? Do you think your library is sexist? Where do you work? All right, thank you. So I think we're at a turning point in the discussions about racism, sexism, transphobia, homophobia, ableism, and any other ism that you can think of. We're talking about them in broader terms, but I think the conversation is further on with sexism than it is with racism, for example. All these things are underpinned by structural inequality. So they're all kind of the same conversation, but different facets of the same conversation. So how are we defining racism? Is it prejudice? Is it discrimination? Is it burning crosses and white hoods? Is it segregated drinking fountains and buses? Is it black men and women being gunned down by police violence? Too often we frame racism as individual prejudice or discrimination, individual acts. I got asked this question at work a few weeks ago. How can an organisation, a system or society be racist, sexist, transphobic, homophobic? And I get it. It's easy to conceive of how one individual can be those things. It's harder to understand how big organisations and systems can also be those things. Because the truth of it is that it's encoded into the DNA of our society. For women, this looks like the expectation that you'll aspire to marriage and children, and when you do so, you'll have it all. It looks like a profession which is 74% women, but there's still an 8.3% gender pay gap. It looks like unrealistic beauty standards. It looks like period property. Structural racism, that looks like a profession that's 97% white. Look around the room, you'll see proof of it right in front of you. It looks like a society that's never seen a black prime minister. It's looking around and not seeing yourself reflected in culture, books, television, film, It's the continued existence of movements like Black Lives Matter. So I'd like to see a show of hands again. Does your organisation have a strategy? Excellent. I'd like to see a show of hands if you've been involved in shaping or developing your strategy. Great, thank you. So, as the show of hands has told us, most organisations have one. But why do these isms still exist then? Why do they persist? For people in marginalised communities, I think these strategies feel tokenistic. I think people can view them with a degree of cynicism because the truth of it is sometimes it feels like it's lip service. Strategies are not actions. Sometimes they feel like they don't go far enough or that progress is glacial. But that doesn't mean your organisation shouldn't have them. It just means that a strategy won't solve the problem alone. Another show of hands, please. Does your organisation have diversity targets? Great, thank you. So at the King's Fund, we have a work plan for diversity and inclusion. It has about 36 actions. Only a very small proportion of them are targets. The ones that we have are around gender parity, so 50-50 gender parity, and 20% BAME representation on things like our panels, our boards, our committees, our General Advisory Council, and that's by 2022. We also want those same proportions recognised in our outputs, so in our blogs, in our podcasts, with our event speakers. Again, for people in marginalised communities, sometimes targets feel like they're checkbox. Sometimes you hear the word quota as well, and that feels like it's paying lip service sometimes. That doesn't mean we shouldn't have targets, but they alone won't solve the problem. Glad to see my cultural reference landed there. So what's the point of having targets if you don't have the data? You need a baseline. And at the King's Fund, as a representative of the King's Fund here today, I'm happy to hold my hands up and say that we don't have the data. We're failing on that. For example, in our monitoring forms for staff, we don't record sexuality. We don't know the proportion of our staff who are LGBT+. So how can we have targets if we don't have anything to measure them against? We don't have enough data about our own staff, we don't have enough data about our own events attendees, about our programme attendees, about our speakers, because we don't collect it. So we know we have a problem, but we don't know what the scale of the problem is. We're starting to collect that data now, but it means that it'll be a while before we kind of really understand what the issue is or how big the issue is. Collecting the data not only helps you assess the scale of the problem, but it keeps you accountable. You're actively monitoring what's going on in your organisation. So in 2017, the BBC's Outside Source, which is a news programme, they started monitoring the gender balance of their contributors. In January, when they looked at the gender balance of their contributors, it was 39% women. They started monitoring it, and 3 months later in April, it was 51%. It was just that simple act of monitoring who they were inviting to speak that helped to make the change. It stayed at around 50-50 ever since. And out of this, the BBC 50-50 initiative was born. So this monitoring has spread across a lot of programmes now in the BBC. I think it's also a really good story because it's a powerful reminder, again, that we do not exist in a bubble. The BBC, it's a huge organisation with a huge impact on our culture and our cultural conversations. And for us at the King's Fund, we're a policy organisation. We try and influence the direction of health policy. We do this through press coverage. And when the BBC say they want gender parity in their spokespeople, and we don't have gender parity in our spokespeople, it affects us. It pushes us. How can you raise the bar for others within your sector and within your profession? It's not just about modelling great behaviour, it's about pushing others higher and further. Here's another example, and I really like this example because it's an example of how you can take individual action. You don't have to be the BBC, you can just be you. In 2016, the science correspondent at The Atlantic, Ed Yong, he started tracking the gender balance of the quoted sources in his own articles. Since he started doing this, again, the gender balance has averaged out at about 50-50 in his articles, but he was really shocked to find that his average was 24%. 35% featured no female voices whatsoever, none at all. His story reminds us that we're all accountable and responsible for something. What would be on your spreadsheet? What are you responsible for? What change can you make? So in undertaking this work, a challenge that I hear a lot is, I don't have the time. Libraries are under a great amount of pressure, and they always are. We always feel like we have to justify our existence, justify our funding, justify the value that we add to society and our organisations. And so sometimes this feels like an extra burden, being asked to go this little bit further. I want to reframe that. It's not extra time. You've been saving time by not doing this all along. You save so much time. So think of it as reparations. You should be putting in the time now because you've saved a hell of a lot of time all along. And it doesn't have to be so much time. Both Ed Yong and the BBC found that the extra amount of effort was minimal. For BBC Outside Source, it was an extra 2 minutes a day, just to fill in a spreadsheet and say, this was the gender balance of our programme today. For Ed Yong, for every piece he wrote, it was 15 minutes. That's nothing. You go away and make a cup of tea in that time. So when people say, I don't have the time, what do they really mean? In challenging times, I like to ask myself, what would Beyoncé do? I'll tell you what she'd do. She'd find 10 black women who can play the violin. Actually, 10 black women who can dance and play the violin. If Beyoncé can do that, you can definitely do something. So I mentioned before that only a small proportion of the King's Fund's diversity inclusion commitments are about targets. The broad range of them are about cultural change. Cultural change is the other side of the coin. You should have the strategy, you should have the targets, but you should also work at changing the culture of your organisation, of your team, of your services. It's not going to land well otherwise. For a bit of context, the King's Fund is a fairly small organisation. We've got 136 employees, but only 24 of those employees are BAME. That's 18%. Now you might think, oh, that's not too bad. It's double figures. But we're based in central London, where the population is 40% BAME. We're doing pretty badly. We're failing. My library service sits within the communications department at the fund, and it's about a little over 20 people, 23 people. I'm the only BAME person in that department. And that's shocking. I've worked there 10 years. I've always been the only BAME person in that department. So in a fairly homogeneous organisation, it means that we've had to open a lot of eyes up to the reality that other realities exist. Our culture, everything about our culture tells us that straight, cis, white, middle-class, male experience is the universal, and it isn't. There are things about all of your realities which do not relate to it in all likelihood. So this means that cultural change is hard. Cultural change is always hard. But in a homogenous organisation, in a homogenous profession, it means that we need to persuade people that there's a problem. What does that problem look like? For me, it's constantly getting mixed up with every other South Asian person in the organisation. None of them have green hair. And when I bring it up, people say, well, you've both got non-anglicised names. So do a lot of people. I think people are very keen to explain things away that they're uncomfortable about. In 2012, an all-party parliamentary group report found that job applicants with white English names were 74% more likely to get shortlisted than someone with a minority name. Does your recruitment panel look like this? I don't think those things are unrelated. And this is when they have exactly the same qualifications. So in 2018, at the King's Fund, we implemented blinded recruitment policies. We have the names taken off all the applications. It's acknowledging that unconscious bias is at work. And we don't necessarily have power over our unconscious bias. We can be aware of it. But what we do have power over is how we recruit. So this is what we've done. This quote is from David Cameron. It's from a speech that he gave in 2015, and he was launching a pledge for employers to sign up to for name-blind recruitment. I think his tone of surprise in this quote is very telling. It's the kind of surprise that comes from someone who was a member of the Bullingdon Club. It's the tone of surprise for someone who was educated at Eton and Oxford. For people in the room who are people of colour, there's nothing surprising about this. It's still disgraceful, but it's not surprising. So our applications are blinded for names. Unfortunately, it's not compulsory yet for our applications to be blinded for educational institutions. There were people in our organisation that said it was pretty important for them to know whether someone was educated at Oxford. We're working on it. A 2017 London School of Economics study of who's who biographical data found that Clarendon schools, which are kind of like the public schools like Eton, Harrow, Rugby, Westminster, they're 94 times more likely to be in the UK's elite. Yet they educate 0.15% of children in the UK. In 2017, 25% of MPs were Oxbridge graduates. 1% of the UK population attended Oxbridge. I want you to think about how this dynamic plays out within our own profession. There are perceptions attached to the educational institutions that are our library schools. We have a perception that UCL is a very traditional cat and class type place. How does that play in when you're looking for someone for your team? Sometimes it could just be as simple as, I went to that library school too. I like you. This is actually a real board, by the way. It's a board of a bank. We mustn't forget that boards are key in making diversity and inclusion work. I'm very keen on what can happen with collective power. But the system that we work within means that the power is concentrated at the top, and so we can't ignore that they have great influence. But boards also hold organisations accountable. Who owns diversity and inclusion in your organisation? Is it your chief executive? Are they ultimately responsible? And what happens to them when they fail? I'd wager not very much. But a great board should hold the chief executive accountable. So what happens when these targets fail? Organisational culture is also influenced by boards. When your board looks like this, what is the likelihood that they understand the impediments that are in the way of others who don't look like them? How much are they aware of their own unconscious bias? How much is diversity and inclusion even on their radar? That trickles down into an organisation. So, in response to this at the King's Fund, we have started trialling a reverse mentoring scheme this year. And in fact, quite early on, we had a rethink. We were like, no, actually, it's not a reverse mentoring scheme. That implies a direction of power. It's a mentoring scheme. We pair up more junior staff who hold different characteristics to the members of our board and our senior management team. And they cultivate a mentoring relationship. They share their life experiences. Mentees bring their work situations with them. And what we can do, because I'm a mentor too, is we can say, well, have you thought about it from this perspective? Very often, people in positions of power are not in positions to hear this kind of feedback every day.